Today I'm going to show you how to change the front brakes and rotors on this 2006 Chevy Impala. First, either rotate the steering wheel or just pull the steering knuckle towards you. That'll make it easier to access the bolts that you need to take off the caliper and the caliper bracket. Start with the caliper bolts, 13 millimeters. Now either tie this off on something or set it inside on top of the CV axle. Do not let it hang by the brake hose. And I can pull off the old pads and discard them. These had plenty of meat left on them, but when it's time to turn the rotors, you always want to also replace the brake pads. There's also going to be a set screw that holds the rotor on. This one is a T30 Torx. Most of the time these will come out just by hand pressure. But if you find that it's too tight and the entire assembly wants to spin, just take a screwdriver, insert it into one of the cooling slots on the rotor, rotate it until it hits against the caliper bracket, and that'll stop everything from turning. Now if you're also replacing the rotors, you have to remove the caliper bracket. It's held on with two 15mm bolts on the back side of the spindle here. These are usually pretty tight, so you want to use a pretty long breaker bar in order to get these off. Once they're loose, you can get them off with a regular ratchet. Keep in mind from the factory, these have thread locker on them, so they'll be a little difficult to get out the whole way. Once those are off, just remove the caliper bracket, and then the rotor should come off. Okay, the rotors are back from the machine shop, so we're going to clean them up with some brake cleaner. It's even more important to clean them up if you have new rotors, because new rotors ship with a thin layer of oil to stop them from rusting in storage. Best thing to use is just some brake cleaner and a piece of cardboard. Just go around. Gets all the metal particles and things off. Now to slide the rotor back on, making sure to line up the hole for that little set screw. The set screw is not critical, but it does aid in reassembling, so it's not the end of the world if you lose it. And it doesn't have to be crazy tight either, just holding the rotor with your hand to stop it from rotating should be enough. Now you have to retract the caliper pistons back into the caliper. To do that, you're going to need a C-clamp and one of the old brake pads. Just set the brake pad in there. Take the C-clamp, find a place where it'll squarely bite on. On these cars, I set the C-clamp forcing screw directly on top of the bolt that holds the brake line on. Be very careful that you don't hit the brake line itself, because it will bend. Although it doesn't take very much pressure to compress the caliper pistons back in. If it does take a lot of force, it means the caliper's probably seized. They should go right back in. There's no reason to apply any excessive force when they hit bottom. When you feel the slightest bit of resistance, then stop compressing. Now, whether you remove the caliper bracket or not, you want to clean up the grease inside of these slide pins, and they usually just pull right out of there. If they're not seized, take some brake cleaner and just clean off some of the old grease. It's not all going to come off, but it doesn't have to be perfect. I always use a silicone-based brake lubricant to lubricate these. Regular grease will melt from the heat of the brakes and can get onto the rotor surface. And doesn't take very much, so you don't have to go crazy with it. Just put a thin layer somewhere and just work it into the bracket. And then just push the boot until it seats. Once the boot is seated, work it some more. And do the same thing for the other slide pin. Now for the caliper bracket bolts, I like to use just a single drop of red Loctite. Don't use any more than that because you'll never get this bolt off. Now just carefully put the caliper bracket in place, line up the bolt holes. And while you run the bolts down, hold the caliper bracket against the steering knuckle so that it doesn't bang against the rotor. Now I usually torque these down to around 100 foot-pounds. Specs for your car may be different, so make sure you look up and verify. Now before I set the new pads in place, I like to just go over everything with some brake cleaner first. Now just take the new pad, set it in its guides, just make sure it's flat against the rotor. Now make sure the brake hose didn't get twisted or kinked at all. Take the caliper and just carefully set it on top of the pads, and then start the caliper bolts. And these bolts, I don't bother with a torque wrench. Torque spec is 26 foot-pounds on them, but I just turn them about a quarter turn past snug. Just definitely don't go crazy with them because you don't want to strip out the slide pin. The other side is the exact same procedure, it's just a mirror image of it.